Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone watching today, and welcome to today's session of Global Insights. In today's panel, we're hosting student experts from the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Canada, American University in the United States, and the University of Warwick, who are speaking on the topic of COVID-19 and its impact on equality. My name is Scott Hamilton. I'm the research coordinator at the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for today's Global Insights session. A warm welcome to all our participants joining us today in the audience. We invite you to direct any questions for our panelists using the Q&A function of your Zoom page, and we'll do our best to put your questions back to all of our panelists if time allows. So before we begin, I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. And for those in the audience that are tuning in from outside of Canada, one of the actions we take to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. The Balsillie School is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. It is the traditional territory of the Atawandran, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. To start us off on today's conversation, let's introduce our panel. Sarah Murray is a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Wilfrid Laurier University. Her research focuses on disability rights and global governance. Philip O.K. Thomas is a master's student studying international affairs, global governance, politics, and security at American University School of International Service in Washington. Philip's research focuses on global governance and democracy in Africa. Benny Skinner is a Master of Global Governance student at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Benny's research focuses on queer migration and how Canadian understandings of gender and sexuality affect immigration law. Rohil Vaidya is pursuing a Master's in International Relations at the University of Warwick in the UK. He's currently working with Global Insights as a research assistant, and his interests include tracing identity discourses in religiosity and populism and their effects on foreign policy, with a specific focus on South Asia as a site of identity anxieties that are shaping global politics. So thank you once again, everyone, to all our panelists for sharing your insights with us today. So let's set the stage for today's discussion. We're now at about the 2-year mark of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to take stock of how the world has changed, specifically with respect to equality, both within countries and globally. Health is an obvious place to start. So Philip, turning to you first to kick us off, what are some of the global inequities highlighted in the global vaccination campaign today?
Thank you for that question, Scott, and happy to be with everybody today. Some of the inequities center around distribution of vaccines, particularly in the global south. Vaccine distribution struggles the health access we have around the world, and with many countries, especially in Africa, struggling to logistically store and administer the vaccine. We've seen many countries have to reject vaccines due to capacity issues, short vaccine shelf lives, and with much in the developed world, vaccines and boosters are quite abundant. Here in the US, we saw our health system come to the brink, and with many other health systems around the world saw the same thing. And quick fixes are having to be administered to countries that have the health access that isn't truly lived up to in more developed countries. With the goal of reaching 70% in the vaccination rate by mid-2022, we are seeing some countries having to work faster with less resources to achieve this goal. And many of which are severely underfunded, that we've seen historic underfunding in many minority populations and low-income countries as well. This is why I kind of reject many of the articles that we're seeing about the vaccine distribution side of the global vaccination campaign being over. We are very much still in the middle of the vaccine distribution effort, and I hope that we can put things forward to make it a more equitable access for everybody around the world.
Thank you, Philip. It's interesting when you reflect upon the larger kind of systemic difficulties in terms of vaccine distribution, how each nation handles these. If we turn more towards, let's say, the individual scale or how this affects bodies, individualized bodies themselves, Sarah, how has the COVID-19 virus impacted bodies or persons with disabilities in particular?
So that's also a very good question. I always start off by giving some stats. People with disabilities make up 15 to 20% of the global population. So it's over 1 billion people. So it's quite a sizable number. And people over the age of 65 are a third of them live with disability in some form. And it's only growing as we have bigger access to healthcare and longer lives. In terms of the COVID-19 virus, people with disabilities have been disproportionately affected. They've had higher mortality rates, some studies saying as much as 3 times more likely to die of COVID-19, longer hospital stays, more readmission due to COVID-19. Depending on the nature of the disability, some people are unable to follow COVID-19 health and safety guidelines, or they find healthcare inaccessible due to various lockdown protocols and lack of mobility. So cancellation of things like non-essential healthcare, which could mean things like personal support workers in the home, has resulted in declining health for a lot of people with disabilities, which in turn increases the risk of contracting COVID-19. Where people with disabilities are, where illness is widespread and affecting people not just with disabilities, the control groups, the medical tests, the studies, they're usually based around able-bodied persons. So people with disabilities are oftentimes excluded from the science behind treatment. And regarding conversations about vaccine access, people with disabilities, despite most people with disabilities being considered a high risk for COVID-19 related treatment and illness, have actually had to struggle getting access to these vaccines. And it's doubly so in places where vaccine access is less available in general. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. It's interesting when we think about the first answer by Philip, when we look at large scale systems, your answer when we look at how it affects people in need on the ground. But if we circle back, what encompasses both is, of course, scientific consensus. And so I want to turn to Rohio on this, looking at the science that affects both of those areas. What exactly has COVID-19 meant for the politics of scientific consensus and the ways in which states and societies relate to scientific communities and affect these issues that Philip and Sarah are speaking about?
Great. Thank you for the question. It's great to be here, first of all. And about scientific consensus, there was a very obvious kind of anti-expert, anti-science sentiment that was seen in a lot of nations where, at the same time, there were too many vaccines at the end of the day, right? So what Philip talked about in the sense of vaccine equity, it was also kind of ironic to see the same places denying vaccines to other states, also then rejecting vaccines as a population. And that kind of comes from this idea of conspiracy theories and how they've been weaponized by populist interests. So while conspiracy theories were earlier just interesting things on the internet that nobody really talked about, they've become potent ideological tools. And now the way they're being used, they don't question critically their own structures of knowledge, but they rather question everything else with abandon, without any kind of restriction, which makes their entire basis of knowledge in the fact that they just question authority, which is why something like a pandemic, which requires certain controls to be put in place, would then be faced with challenges from people who term themselves skeptics, but then it becomes worse and worse if they refuse to engage with scientific consensus at their own level. And then about politicized science, I think there is a hope there, because if science moves out of its isolation within the rest of academia as an apolitical space or as a depoliticized subject, and realizes its own reliance on political knowledge structures to exist, it can meaningfully engage with that discourse. And once it does that, it can then move out from being just knowledge about the world out there, which is then co-opted by people, and it can have an agency of its own to push back problems like marginalization and oppression. And we've kind of already seen this start in the climate studies community, where they've started pushing back to climate deniers, for instance.
Oh, thank you. It's interesting when you speak about science and how it can be mobilized in different ways, in different forms of political agency. Gives some people a voice, and it also reduces the voice of others. And I want to focus on the reduction of that voice, or people that are lost in this conversation. Turning to Benny, what are the additional impacts of such labored healthcare and public health systems due to the pandemic on queer individuals?
Thanks for the question, Scott, and thank you so much to everyone for having me here. There are quite a few impacts. I mean, there's the obvious impact. So, for example, obviously, a lot of the LGBTQ plus population is affected by HIV, and I've seen a lot of great literature as of late, kind of focusing on the loss of HIV medication and access to that kind of care. As a result of the pandemic. So the UN recently put out a report indicating that 23% of participants living with HIV in a study, they lost complete access to this kind of care, which is obviously super detrimental. But I think that two really big areas that are striking and very, very impactful for specifically the queer population is mental health and transgender healthcare. So the loss of access to mental health resources and public health resources is massively detrimental to the LGBTQ population because the LGBTQ plus people are already considerably more likely to experience poor mental health due to stigmatization and, of course, societal oppression. And so the losses of these sorts of resources can be extremely life-threatening for this population, right? And then on top of that, the loss of access to gender-affirming healthcare and procedures can also be very, very life-threatening for transgender individuals. And unfortunately, these are the kinds of resources and procedures that get pushed to the side in the face of a global pandemic in the name of the health of the greater public, which although it's a lot of people have lost out on certain types of care, these are specifically types of healthcare that are already marginalized. They're already so scarce, and so losing what little access people do have to that can be extremely dangerous for a lot of people. Thank you.
No, thank you. When you talk about the kind of the illumination of this inequality the pandemic brings to light, I actually want to turn towards that. And I want to ask our panel some questions about the structural inequities that COVID-19 is kind of shining a flashlight on in our society. It's almost revealing these cracks and these fissures that were always there, but now we can look at them in a new light. So Philip, I'm going to return to you. What exactly are some of the barriers to responses at the grassroots or community level to COVID-19, and how can these be overcome?
Right, and I think my answer will build kind of off of what Benny had just talked about. And it's the large barrier to resources and access for many community-based organizations, nonprofits, and civil society organizations, which have been severely impacted by COVID-19. Many of these grassroots organizations are multifaceted responders. Not only are they administering tests, vaccine information, and personal protective equipment against COVID-19, but they're also doing community-based factors such as addressing school closures, food inequities, and the lack of access to healthcare and other social inequities that we are really seeing being exacerbated by this pandemic. The critical way to really impact these and overcome these is that governments need to be working in tandem with people and meeting people where they are. We can't just put out information or resources and expect people to come and get it. We really have to take it to where they are living and where they're staying and where they ultimately are thriving in. Funding must be equitable in these communities, and it must be administered not from a more, I would say, top down, but from a bottom up perspective, one that really goes with civil society organizations that have a proven track record of addressing social inequities for many people, regardless of their social factors. So those are just some of the ways to overcome, but it still takes work. It still takes time, and the funding really needs to be there from governments and those that are willing to listen.
Well, thanks. It's a great insight to speak about how we can't expect people to just automatically flock to a lot of these new initiatives. We need to take it to them. I think we need to bring the help to these marginalized or stigmatized groups. So on that note, I'd like to turn to Benny and ask about how the COVID-19 pandemic has maybe exacerbated the structural barriers and systemic disadvantages that queer individuals might face on a regular basis.
Yeah, queer individuals, I think one of the biggest markers of being a queer individual is your likelihood to experience socioeconomic instability. LGBTQ plus people are highly overrepresented within homeless populations and also in industries that have actually been more highly disrupted due to the pandemic. They tend to be industries such as restaurant, retail, cosmetics and grooming, sex work, those sorts of things. And so what we're seeing now is these disadvantages are being amplified, and the effects of that are individuals being kind of pushed more into marginalization in terms of being pushed further into homelessness, having to be forced to rely on more social resources, and because of the scarcity of specifically queer-oriented social resources, being forced to use resources that aren't necessarily safe for them to use. So things like general shelters can be very dangerous for the queer population, right? And since queer-based shelters are already so rare, especially on a global level, LGBTQ plus people are being pushed further into this marginalization, further down kind of this socioeconomic ladder, but then being forced to use resources that are not adequate for their needs and not safe. So we're seeing this kind of this shift, but also we're seeing a lot of abuse and scapegoating coming out of the pandemic as well. So for example, there's a case recently in Uganda where a LGBTQ plus shelter was raided by neighbors and by security forces. People were charged for things like what was called like negligent acts likely to spread infection. There's this kind of, it's almost like being used as an excuse to target these populations as well and target these resources that people are being forced to try and rely on. So there's a lot of exacerbation of the structural barriers for sure, and a lot of exacerbation of that systemic disadvantage.
Oh, well said. Especially when I guess if COVID-19 illuminates the structural inequalities in a society, you talk about how it also increases the pressures on those groups. And if we turn to other groups, Sarah, how have the responses, both international and national, to COVID-19 harmed or hindered persons with disabilities? And if they have, please elaborate how they have.
So they definitely have. Just on Benny's note about COVID exacerbating economic inequalities or instability, it's the same situation with people with disabilities in that with shutdowns, lockdowns, lack of access to transportation, lack of access to what would be considered non-essential assistance or non-essential healthcare assistance have further driven people with disabilities out of the job market and put them in more precarious situations. Another thing that's come up that has been very interesting, but quite serious for people with disabilities is the idea that all of the pandemic protocols have been designed around the idea of an able-bodied person. And so a lot of the time people with disabilities are completely excluded from policymaking, and it's had some pretty serious consequences. One of which is we keep seeing this debate of triage of COVID-19 treatment, and triage based not on the efficacy of the treatment, the most that can be done with the least resources, but in terms of who is more deserving or who has a better quality of life and then should be treated. So you've seen a couple articles about it where doctors have prioritized younger people over older people, or people who are paraplegic have been put aside for people who are considered more able-bodied and stuff. So the issue with that is it's not based off of, it's based off of a subjective evaluation of quality of life that's rooted in ableism. And really, healthcare professionals are not actually qualified to make quality of life evaluations. Like that is down to the person with disabilities themselves or their designated advocate, their loved ones. Studies have already shown that these evaluations are wildly inaccurate and that doctors and other healthcare professionals will downgrade the quality of life for people with disabilities, and people with disabilities will instead view their lives as having value and joy. So we see a lot of conversation about how do we value people who are different, people with disabilities, and that valuation of them has resulted in some pretty serious health issues.
Well, thanks, Sarah. You mentioned there about obviously sustaining a quality of life. And we've heard talks actually from everyone in this segment of the panel about job markets, the socioeconomic pressures. We've heard discussions of shelters and homelessness as well. So if I turn to Rohil, what exactly does the COVID-19 pandemic mean for dominant discourses of economic development today?
Right. Thank you, Scott. So as you mentioned, it really does kind of form the basis for a lot of what has already been discussed. So I'd like to focus on two kind of central aspects to how economic discourses are framed in a dominant form. So one is how it's always framed in the sense of a national economy, and the second is how it's always framed in terms of growth. So these two kind of dominant ideas of what an economy looks like, one that it always exists at a national scale, and two, that it always grows and never really stops growing, they've kind of become very naturalized. And any kind of discussion and debate that goes outside this framework, that either looks at subnational economies as entities in themselves without necessarily plugging back into a national economy, and economic forms of production or activity that don't contribute to growth, they're more or less delegitimized. So if discourse can move towards talking about economic growth or economic development in terms that isn't centered on growth and isn't centered just on the nation, what we'll see is a movement towards discussions that talk about something either that looks at post-growth or degrowth, where non-GDP-like markers are used to talk about an economy's health. So something like how healthy people are, what their quality of life is, how much protection do at-risk communities enjoy. Those start becoming more important, and something broad-based and profit-centric like a GDP or a GNP or even something like an HDI, which looks at very specific things and leaves out other kinds of information, they become sidelined. So it's this mixture of a progressive project and an academic project where a lot of critical theory comes in. And it's something that I think academics have been working on for a long time, and it will become more relevant as we go into the future.
For sure. I know when we talk about economic development, we hear a lot of numbers, GDP, flows of products, and even today we hear a lot about shortages and supply chains, but ultimately the essence of the economy is interaction, how people engage one another, and how COVID-19 is changing that. And so I'd like to focus, turn the panel to focus on that nature of interaction right now and the way people have changed in the way they engage one another. We've changed how we engage with our communities, with our institutions, and with each other, right? We're all on Zoom instead of being in the same room as usual. So Benny, I'm going to turn to you first for this section. How exactly has decreased mobility due to the COVID-19 pandemic impacted queer individuals and their safety? Things like interstate mobility and intra-state mobility as well.
Right. My research specifically focuses on queer migration. And so just talking about mobility, like and being able to migrate away from places is a really, really, really important thing for LGBTQ people across the board globally, right? It's becoming much more common for people to migrate to countries where they're safer. And that's kind of just, it's a matter of survival. And obviously that's something that has been significantly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Migration is much more difficult, and it was already difficult for queer individuals in general, right? Especially when it comes to bringing their families with them, and getting refugee status and stuff like that. And so the lack of mobility in fleeing unsafe environments, is fleeing state-sponsored violence, community violence, things like that, extremely detrimental to queer populations everywhere in the globe. But then also on top of that, lack of mobility within your area of living, even if it's within a state, is very much, it's a scary thing for queer people. Stay-at-home orders when you live in an abusive environment is of course always it's a great danger to a lot of people's health and safety, right? So in terms of the decrease in mobility I think that's a really scary thing for the queer population, to be quite frank with you right now.
Oh, thank you. It's a lot of detrimental impacts that you're speaking about right now. And so turning to Sarah, have these detrimental impacts materialized for persons with disabilities as well? Or have you seen any positive effects or positive changes from the pandemic? And also, if there have been any beneficial positive changes or actions, could you identify any of those?
Yeah, so there is actually a pretty big silver lining when it comes to the pandemic and persons with disabilities. We're experiencing unprecedented access to engage with their communities. So things like Zoom, things like online education, shopping, leisure, these are more accessible than ever before in the past. It means that people with disabilities who would otherwise have had to forego these activities are now able to join the conversation, have their voice heard, participate in the world they live in. I think it's been a little frustrating for some people with disabilities because a lot of these accommodations have been requested for years and have only been really brought out now that it serves the majority, but at least it's happening now. The biggest issue, obviously, the biggest drawback to this is really only true for people with disabilities who have access to digital technologies and the internet. So people in low-income countries, people with disabilities are much more likely to live in poverty. So all of these barriers are what prevents the benefits from really impacting the group as a whole. But there is definitely potential benefits that the COVID-19 protocol and the expansion of online living have provided for some people with disabilities. So that's kind of nice to see.
Yeah, it's nice to see some positive silver linings as you describe them. And of course, we see a lot of detrimental impacts that Benny described. So I want to, if we look at both of those, let's say an overarching impact or a narrative, let's say. I'm going to turn to Philip and ask, Philip, can you describe some of the largest, most impactful inequities that still affect our pandemic response to this day?
For sure. I think one of the largest inequities is the ability to isolate still to this day is a true hardship for many people around the world. Many people cannot afford to stay home from work, don't have the ability to work from home, and to isolate from their families. So testing continues to be a large issue with many, and it's quite expensive for some families to be able to actually acquire back a test. And people's personal conditions really determine how much they can protect themselves from COVID-19 and the inequities that follow suit from it. The inequities of income distribution are being exacerbated from this pandemic. People in low-income populations and minority groups are often the ones bearing the brunt whenever it comes to pandemic inequities. At the same time, the economic fallout and shocks that have happened from this. So the ability to actually take the time from your day, from your job, is still one that is still being felt today. And we really don't have a clear answer for how this is going to be mitigated. I would hope that companies, workplaces would put in the proper steps and tools to be able to have people actually take the time off and still receive their full benefits, their full pay, without having to dive into maybe food insecurity, housing insecurity. We know so many people are behind on rent till this day. So these things need to be addressed, whether they're on a governmental level or a social inequity level. And I think the largest inequity that I'm still seeing today is just around the isolation itself.
Well, thanks. When you talk about the inability to isolate, especially from your family, I have a 1-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy, and we're all at home. So I feel you. You hit the nail on the head with that one. Just don't tell them I said that. but you do mention with these crises, it reveals not only inequities, but also possibilities. So I want to turn to Rohil on this one. And I know with certain crises, you have actors that might take advantages of the situation. They might swoop in and use it to their own benefit. But there's also the possibility for progressive action and progressive change and new ideas and new institutions that maybe weren't relevant before might open up. So Rohil, what possibilities for progressive action do you see COVID-19 opening up for all of us?
Right. Thanks, Scott. So one of the kind of, I think, major shifts that we will see remain important is COVID as a historical conjuncture, because it really has given people this one big event to form their thoughts around in terms of how interconnected the world is. And now that interconnection is no longer just between people, where people keep talking about, the world is now a global village and there you are so connected. But below that just superficial understanding of interconnection, now we're also connected to the natural world. Because the way, if not COVID, whichever pandemic you choose or whichever disease you choose, which is zoonotic in origin, really did come because of certain limits of natural distance being breached, where people went somewhere where they shouldn't have been. They were interacting with species that usually don't interact with human beings. So because of these problems, I think COVID has given us this very important reference to kind of go back to, point to, and say, look, that was a mistake, and we should take certain steps to prevent that from happening again. Now, that only doesn't have to focus on collective movements and collective action groups or social groups. It can also impact governments. Even though thinking around governance is more cynical in general, one could still expect governments to respond to it. And taking that idea of governments on board is important, because it cannot only be people on the ground. Because as has been talked about in this discussion before, even though these groups are important, they are stretched when it comes to actually being funded and doing the best they can. And you need states to kind of consolidate funding and do and kind of organize these things in a better manner. And second, and this is a more minor point, but it's also important to think of how long COVID might affect people's memory of COVID itself. And as Sarah's been talking about disability, there is this very important question to be asked around how disabilities are viewed, how difference is viewed, and how we construct the normal person, in quotes, and how we construct the abnormal person. So I think these questions will become more important, and they do form significant seeds for change.
Well, I like how you reference this as a juncture point, kind of an important historical moment that one day historians will look back upon this and they'll have several lessons from it, I'm sure, that hopefully will guide the future in a bit more of a progressive or structured manner. But let's look at today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we're 2 years into this pandemic. So what are the lessons that we have learned today, or what are the lessons that we should have learned that maybe we haven't put into action yet? And Philip, I'm going to turn to you first on this one. What are the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic response in terms of inequities? What should form the next response to a pandemic that was not in place for this particular COVID-19 pandemic?
Right. I would hope it kind of bounces off of what Rohil just said. I would hope that one important lesson is that we know the world is much smaller than we think. And that actions that take place in one side of the world have implications for wherever you are. The interconnectivity of our world continues to be tested, whether it's the supply chains that we are seeing, supply chain issues we are seeing, the global disparities that we are all having a common denominator with. But we must be mindful of the ways in which people interact with health systems, even in the most untraditional ways. And building upon those and improving those access to capacity should take center stage. We have to be able to readapt our responses to the pandemic. And now that we are 2 years in, our collective thinking is much different than where we were 2 years ago. And if we fail to build up these health capacities around the world, we run the risk of repeating the same mistakes that we made towards the beginning of the pandemic, whenever it came to the mass isolationism that we saw pop up at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. Whenever it comes to I would say another lesson is that we need to reject the return to normalcy and instead advocate for a better conditions for those that have been affected by the pandemic and subsequent pandemics in the future. And the historic disparities we are seeing already here in the world, it needs to take mass mobilization to really address those.
Thanks, Philip. Excuse me. I like how you stress the fact that we're all interconnected and that we all share the sense of humanness, right? We're all vulnerable to COVID-19, regardless of where we are on the planet. But of course, we see very different reactions to it from states, from societies and cultures. And so I want to turn to Raheel on this one and ask about really the collective memory of COVID-19 and how should this pandemic shape future state, society, and citizen relationships going forth?
Right. Thank you, Scott. So in terms of state, society, and citizen relationships, I think, again, kind of bouncing off what Philip just said and my last answer, COVID can really fuel the right kinds of resistances that one might require from minority and marginalized communities to give them a sense of agency, because far too often we see this paternalistic top-down idea where the problems of marginalized communities are identified by people who aren't members of those communities in the first place. So that agency, kind of taking it back and then writing your own story in a way, becomes very important. And then it is also important to understand that the state exists for a reason. Much too often, the other side of the argument just ignores the state as an entity or sees it as this block of problems that nobody wants to deal with. But I think taking on board the pragmatic, real, kind of cynical nature of the state, and then understanding how it can be adapted to fit more progressive and different narratives will become important, because not only has the pandemic showed the limits of state action, but it has also showed the limits of progressive action, how in a short amount of time, people can only access so much resource and only access so many other people to promote change. So all in all, I think it does kind of become a very important thing, again, to refer back to and think about when we think about how we see governments. And as kind of a concluding point, the rise of populism comes at a very odd time because we've also seen spectacular failures of governance at the same time. So being able to maintain that very paradoxical hypocrisy where you have leaders who kind of go on the charm offensive while at the same time leaving behind a trail of destruction during the pandemic, it will be very interesting to see how that goes ahead and how that discussion becomes more untenable, because within that contradiction really lies a lot of hope for progressive action and hope for maybe even rescuing politics from kind of what we know, these dirty kind of very political or politicized elements. So kind of rescuing at least some spaces for marginalized people to reclaim a voice.
Mm-hmm. So the top-down failures of that old established structure actually open up new possibilities for agency and action, and on top of that, new spaces as well, new geographies. And so I actually want to turn to that idea, not just, we talked about agency and bodies, but in terms of actual space. Benny, how exactly has the pandemic provided increased availability and access to queer spaces? And what impact does this have for queer individuals and communities going forth?
Yeah, kind of tagging on to Sarah's previous note about accessibility through online spaces, the queer community has been relatively successful in transitioning to the utilization of online spaces and online networking to continue to connect the community further. Also, there's that added level of safety when things have, everything has transitioned online. So you can access these things without having to go to a physical space, which in turn helps to increase kind of engagement, connectedness. And speaking on kind of Rohil's notes about, mobilization, there's an increased opportunity for the mobilization of queer politics through this engagement, right? And through this connectiveness, because we're no longer requiring people to actually go physically to spaces and put themselves in potential danger, they can engage through online platforms and actually, engage with those politics and engage with the mobilization, which is really amazing. So although, the lack of mobility has been a detriment in many ways, it's also there, like Sarah said, there's a silver lining, right? There's an increased access to these kinds of spaces for people who couldn't actually physically go to events, physically go to protests, stuff like that. Now that we're doing things more online, people are able to actually engage much more effectively.
Well, thanks. Now we've talked a lot about humanness, connectedness, and also some difficulties when it comes to movement. And Sarah, you're kind of being identified as the silver lining person on the panel. So I'm going to turn to you for another silver lining and ask, how should we, as academics, as policymakers, as citizens, as governments, what should we take from the experiences of persons with disabilities over the course of the pandemic? And has it maybe provided opportunities or those silver linings to create a more inclusive and accessible world for persons with disabilities?
Yes. So, I mean, I think it has, in that doors have been opened. Just thinking about, I think it was Rohil that said there's been a failure of the top-down response type to dealing with the pandemic nationally, internationally, et cetera. And that failure, I'm hoping, will open doors for voices of the disabled community to kind of highlight why their experiences have gone as wrong as they have, kind of thing. Like, we need to have them involved in every stage of planning, whether it be from the very bottom to the very top, because if you don't have these voices, we'll just see a repeat of the next pandemic, and that these people will be completely overlooked. I guess one of the biggest things that has been a positive and a negative is it's really allowed us to look at ableism. Ableism is one of those things where it's very unlikely to be talked about. It's quite insidious. It's not nearly as overt as some other forms of discrimination, although all forms of discrimination have also underlying issues as well. So this issue of ableism and basing everything around the able-bodied, hopefully now that we have these doors open, we can have more dialogue about this, more pushing the disability mantra, which is nothing about us without us, talking about the ethics of evaluating human bodies. These are all things that, while not necessarily, like, they're predicated on the failures of what's happened with people with disabilities during the pandemic, but hopefully seeing these experiences, seeing the increased fatality rates, seeing the lack of access to healthcare and the impact on people's lives will force us to have these conversations. And that is what we need to do if we want to address any of these issues in the future for this group.
Thank you. That is a silver lining. And it's interesting because we're seeing a lot of issues, problems. The pandemic has been like a flashlight to reveal these cracks and fissures, but from everyone, I've noticed a lot of hope coming from failure, right? And from failure, that's where you learn. It's where you can actually make adjustments in the future. As a great Canadian philosopher once said, the cracks, to paraphrase him, cracks are what lets the light in. Cracks are where the light comes in. The great Leonard Cohen. So on that note, we can look at this with a sense of maybe not optimism, but hope, and we can learn from our failures. Let's look to the future, because COVID-19, we know, will not be the last pandemic. There will be something coming sometime in the future. So how should we do things differently? And Benny, I'm going to start with you on this one. Globally, how should governments address the additional impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on queer individuals?
I think, honestly, there's got to be a greater consideration for the state of being a queer individual, and that's on a global scale. I think what's difficult right now is that let's just say all the governments in the world, they're all at different places in terms of how they interpret the LGBTQ plus population and how they treat those populations, right? So it's so hard to kind of get a global consensus or even get a global discussion going on this, because some countries don't even recognize the existence of these people. And then some countries, there's a stronger sentiment of oppression towards these people. So there's there's a lot of disparities, but I think that what governments really need to do is start considering the unique ways in which queer individuals need to live their lives, due to, a combination of obviously legal implications, social implications, obviously the socioeconomic situation for most queer individuals is very different than the general population, right? So I think that it's special consideration is probably my biggest thing for governments going forward, is not just looking, and I'm sure that this would go very similarly, Sarah, for people with disabilities, is we need to really operate on a basis of equity rather than equality. So looking at what people need based on their specific context, rather than saying, well, everyone is the same across the board, right? So I think that's definitely how we need to move forward, is just with equity in mind at all times.
Well, thanks, Benny. And of course, governments have to learn that lesson and not forget it. It has to be maintained and reinforced and ingrained into these systems. So turning to Sarah, and again, maybe a silver lining, I hope, but can any of these beneficial pandemic protocols actually be maintained outside of this pandemic context?
Certainly they can. It struck me, I think it was Philip said the phrase, reject the return to normalcy. If we can kind of incorporate that into the non-pandemic society that we will hopefully be reaching soon, then certainly we can definitely continue to have some of these beneficial protocols for people with disabilities, from the very basic to much more complex things. So for example, even just mask mandates, having people, if you're ill, wear a mask kind of thing. Like there's a lot of people with disabilities who have to police their actions outside their homes. They have to be very cautious going to supermarkets and any kind of public space because of immunocompromised issues. So just things like that even would make a world of difference in the lives of some people. Obviously, the continued access to the internet, access to remote technology, does a lot of benefits for people who have accessibility and mobility issues. The biggest thing obviously will be the planning for the future. Like that is incorporating the voices of persons with disabilities for planning for the future is obviously the most important portion. I don't know if I don't think it's been done well during this pandemic, so I wouldn't say it's something that we can bring forward into non-pandemic times well as we've done it here, but I think that we can learn a lesson from our experiences here, that if you devalue people, or if you don't consider them in the idea of normal, then like Benny was saying, you cannot possibly have equitable treatment ready. You can't have an equitable lifestyle. So I guess those are just some of the things that could be carried on outside of the pandemic context.
Yeah, I should hope so. Like the valuation of humanness and considering every single person is worthy of being treated with respect. I hope those lessons do maintain as well. And so I want to take that kind of mindset and ask that question on a larger scale, turning to Philip. What would this equitable response that we're all speaking of, what would the response to a global pandemic actually look like in the 21st century if it was enacted?
An equitable response would be a united actions on a global health level that goes beyond just one's own borders and rejecting the isolationism that we saw towards the beginning of the pandemic, and making sure our international health regulations are up to date, also updated with multiple perspectives from people that are marginally underserved or historically not had a seat at the table. Thinking ahead will be key, and hindsight will be 2020. So for a better response, we are going to have to take in these different aspects that we have already seen as growing disparities and really truly address them. Responses should avoid punishing countries for speaking up on disease concerns and the trackings that they've seen. I'm turning specifically to South Africa, which felt punished for sounding the alarm on Omicron and then being hit with numerous travel restrictions. Tactics like these disrupt much more than just travel. So in the growing inequities that are seen on a country to country level. And I would say, and the last point would be is the stopping of patents that are hindering the distribution and manufacturing of vaccines around the world.
Thanks. Those are excellent lessons and very hopeful goals, I guess, for all of us going forth and for every country. But for our last question, let's look in the mirror. This is an academic panel. Everyone here seems to be doing their PhD, so let's stare in the mirror and ask Rohil, does the COVID-19 pandemic have implications for what we're doing for international relations as a discipline? What would this exercise entail if we look in the mirror? What can we learn from it?
Great, thanks, Scott. So I think the first thing that came to mind was this idea that you see popping up once in a while in IR literature, where people keep talking about how states have trouble coordinating and cooperating, but then they say, but if there was a global pandemic, that would change. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen in any kind of measure. So I think looking below that surface level of how states interact and seeing that there are things they tacitly ignore very knowingly, but without not being very explicit about it, that allows certain kinds of structures to continue existing, that becomes very important. And kind of fine, nuanced IR literature already does that. It's not something that I've kind of observed, but it's something that needs to be done more often, and it needs to be done with a greater awareness that there are these pre-existing kind of forms of tacit ignorance that exist, and that a global response to COVID was very much possible, but it was also very much not enacted because it wasn't in the best interests of a lot of different kinds of powerful people or a lot of different kind of institutions to make it a better idea. As academics ourselves, as people who engage with knowledge, who try to create new forms of knowledge, I think the biggest idea comes from this idea of reflexivity, where we see ourselves not kind of floating above the world, just describing it for this broader idea of knowledge, but rather as people who are very much in the world, we're inserted into the world as active social functionaries, as active social agents. And that means we ask questions with that awareness, right? So when we set out to ask a question of the world, it's not just based on what our current frameworks or the current level of understanding tells us. It's also about taking on more important and broad understandings of the world. So just as an example, before I wrap up, be moving beyond the triptych of race, gender, and class to include things like disability and age and sexuality, looking at difference in a more critical way, then will become more important.
Thanks, Rohil. And I have to correct myself. Not everyone here is even doing their PhD. Some of you are master's students, but the quality of all the answers just made me assume that they were talking to, if not tenured professors, then PhDs. So I'll correct myself on that one. We have time for one more question from me and maybe hopefully a question from the audience, but this is what I'm going to call the lightning round. So 30-second answer. We do have a lot of policymakers who tune in, and we've got some watching today. And so I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds, what is your advice to policymakers in the audience? And in 30 seconds, give them your best shot. And I'll turn to Sarah first. So Sarah, advice for policymakers.
I feel like I've already said it several times, but the biggest thing is to incorporate the lived experiences and the voices of persons with disabilities and other minority groups. If you aren't taking that into consideration, it's just impossible to produce policy that will equally or equitably benefit people. So definitely the biggest thing at every level, from the top to the very, very bottom, you need to be listening to those voices and having them co-author and co-research all of this policy.
Thank you. And Philip, advice for policymakers.
I would say is the importance of being specific. Overgeneralizations really can leave a lot of people on the wayside. And so making sure that we are enacting policies that truly look at the intersections of people's lives and lived experiences, much like Sarah had just said, and then at the same time, taking in the historical disparities that are truly being exacerbated by this pandemic.
Thank you. And Rohil, advice for policymakers.
Right. Off the top of my head, the most important thing I can think of is just engage with critical thought, because policymaking often becomes a snowball that keeps rolling. So getting more critical thought in there, understanding where people are coming from when they don't agree with policy or certain mainstream discourse. I think there's a lot of rich kind of policy making available there, which can then translate in answers outside government as well.
Thank you. And Benny, your advice for policymakers.
I think I'm going to echo Sarah a little bit, but I facilitate workshops on inclusivity. And something that I have definitely noticed is that regardless of education level, profession, across the board, there's a fundamental, I think, lack of understanding or just a lack of depth in understanding of people who are gender diverse or who have diverse sexual orientations. So please listen to our voices, include us. You know, there are academics who also fall into these populations and who, you know, I premise my academia on my identity, and this is my passion, right? And so having those voices that are able to actually speak to the experience, as well as that kind of that academic or analytical side of that experience, it's really important. So just please include us, listen to us, and yeah, co-author, ask us for help. Because it'll make those policies just so much more effective. And that's really important.
Awesome. Thanks, Benny. Now we have time for one last lightning round. So short 30-second answers. I'm going to turn to the audience for a good question that came in, which is, how has the pandemic shaped or reshaped your view of the world? So we'll go in the same order, 30-second answers. Sarah, how's the pandemic shaped your view of the world?
Oh, I mean, I like to think that I was fairly globally minded before, but the pandemic has really made me appreciate the degree to interconnection that we have in the world, and also how like easy it is to push others out, like in times of crisis, to kind of bring your focus into, oh, just your province or just your country or just even your neighborhood. So it's kind of two things. One is the unfortunate response to kind of isolate and to consider only the immediate people around you, and then also not acknowledging that the world is huge and interconnected, and we really need to stop having that first response if we plan on doing anything to benefit the whole. I don't know if that was coherent, but that's what I think I have learned.
Very coherent, no worries. And Philip, how about you? How's your view of the world been shaped by this?
My view of the world has been shaped by this, by the actions of people is really paramount to how we truly address the inner workings of not only those who are most suffering, but those who might not really truly be affected as much as others. So I think whenever it comes to, you know, taking the time out and to really understand other people's lived and shared experiences, at the same time, the different aspects of life that maybe I wasn't too keen to before the pandemic have certainly been open to me now. And so this interconnectivity of the world has honestly just has blown the doors off and shown me a kind of like a new world as far as how we globally respond to problems such as these.
Thank you. And Rohil, how about you in 30 seconds? How's this shaped your view of the world?
Right, closely related. I think for me, it's just how complex policy making can really be, because you think of it as this thing where you imagine the world, you come up with a solution, but then something like isolation, a person who has only one room in their house, where do they isolate from their family? Something like lockdowns, it might sound great on paper that people stop meeting, but daily wage laborers, what do they do now? So how these very real contradictory effects occur in the world, just how complex it really is. That kind of, it was a moment of realization when the pandemic was unfolding that, yeah, I mean, there are these islands of kind of complexity that exist all around.
Thank you. And last but not least, Benny, how has this shaped your view of the world?
I think definitely the importance of community and connection is something that has been I value community very, very much before the pandemic, but just seeing just how important it is, especially to marginalized populations, has been something that's come about in the last couple of years for sure. And I think that also like the potential for community and connection through the expansion of online spaces, through the expanded encouragement to engage in online spaces, the potential for connection and a global community is something that's been really blown up for me, and it really has expanded my brain in terms of pure potential.
Well said. Pure potential, right? That represents all of you as the next generation of future thought leaders and academics. So that's a great way to finish our panel for today. And I want to thank all of the panelists for what I'm sure you all agree was a great discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it. And please join us next month. We're back for another Global Insights on March 24th, when we're going to examine democracy and dictatorship. So please tune in. And until then, thank you all for watching. Thank you again to our panelists for their incredible answers and the discussion we had today. Take care and stay safe out there.